I want you to imagine something. Your father starts his own business making, let's say, dishwashers. And he proudly names his new company after your last name, so O'Connell Dishwashers. He's very proud of his business, as he should be. It's not the biggest or necessarily the most successful business, but people love O'Connell Dishwashers. They're a good product, and he supports his family with his new business. Then you come along and decide that instead of taking over your father's business, you also want to create a company that also makes dishwashers. And because you think you can make better dishwashers than your father, you name your company Better O'Connell Dishwashers. And not only do your dishwashers end up better than your father's, they're better than any dishwashers, maybe the greatest dishwashers of all time. Well, that's exactly what happened with the motorcycle company we're looking at today, the Brough Superior. The 1920s was a very different decade than the 1910s for motorcycle development. More one-off, interesting, and innovative motorcycle companies were dying than were popping up, thanks mainly to the war, which was very much opposite the previous decade. But one startup company really stands out. The protagonist of our story, George Brough, watched this all unfold as a young man from a very interesting place. His father, William Brough Jr., was an engineer who developed his own bicycles and ultimately in 1902, a full-blown motorcycle manufactured almost entirely in-house, which really was very rare for this time. They were crude and simple, as were most motorcycles at this time, though in 1910 his father would make their first V-twin Brough. During these early years, George's father would push his older brother William to compete on their family machines in trials, but George was really the budding motorcycle enthusiast of the family, forcing his dad to allow him to compete in a long-distance trial in 1906 on one of their older Broughs. And this was at the ripe age of 16. Set to be a 6-day event, George managed to finish the trial in 9 days. Not really the result he was looking for, but he was young and inexperienced. Like so many budding founders of these kinds of great companies, aside from riding, George spent his youth tinkering and learning in his father's shop. Despite his initial struggles in racing, there really is no replacement for passion which he had. Soon George found himself dominating in trials on his dad's motorcycles, and specifically the Brough V-twins. And this would really lay the foundation for his belief in the V-twin amidst the British companies who, at this time, would focus primarily on big singles. William's Brough motorcycles would ultimately move to flat or opposed twins. William really loved the lack of vibrations, and he was an early adopter of this kind of engine, but it was too late. George had already fallen in love with the V-twin, a love that he would never go back on. But engines weren't George's only passion. He also liked chasing girls and driving whatever he could get his hands on entirely too fast around their city streets, until meeting his neighbor Constance Evans and ultimately getting married in 1916. Despite some very interesting and innovative takes on what a motorcycle could be, post-war struggles would push his father's motorcycle company, Brough Motors, out of business, and George's father would move on to other things. But George had other plans to support his young family. Through the war, he worked in engine development for a company called White and Pop, and during this time, he was privileged to get to ride lots of motorcycles from most of the major manufacturers, one of which was Harley's Big Twin, and his affinity for V-twins was really growing, despite his dad's focus on flat twins, and he also came to love Harley's great front suspension setup at this time. Towards the end of the war, George found himself sketching out what he believed could be the perfect motorcycle. This notion of the perfect ultimate machine is common among the founders of many great automotive companies, from Fred Duesenberg to Philip Vincent. This idea of making the absolute best ultimate version of, say, the motorcycle or car really became George's obsession. This wouldn't be accomplished with his first model. George actually took his initial design to his father, but his father wasn't interested. As much as the whole narrative of George setting off on his own and not being able to make it work with his dad really seems rather contentious, it really wasn't. In fact, William set his son up to work on his designs and production in a shop right on his property. And once again, we see that great motorcycle startups through history have mostly shared this one thing, which is a supportive father. But this brings us to the name of George's new company. Obviously, Brough was taken, so George had to go with something different, and while arguing with his friends at the local pub about potential names and going on about how great his motorcycle would be, a bystander said to George, "If it's so superior, why not name it Brough Superior?" And George loved it. Now his dad responded to his hot-headed son's name choice by saying, "I suppose that makes my bike Brough Inferior." I should at this point note that most of the information in this video comes from this incredibly well-researched and well-written book, Brough Superior, The Complete Story, by Peter Miller. It is the definitive work on the Brough story, and I've linked it below so you can go get a copy if you want to learn more. George Brough's first motorcycle was officially unveiled at the end of 1920, labeled as a motorcycle designed for the sporting rider. Powered by a big V twin, and in all honesty, basically a parts bin motorcycle put together from other manufacturers' parts, which is a theme in this company's history, still it looked good and performed really well. The standout feature was the nickel-plated tank, which was wide and large but slim in appearance. And this would be a feature of George's motorcycles really through the entire company's history. Powered by a tuned 980cc JAP V-twin, beautifully polished and customized to George's liking and capable of a claimed 80 miles per hour, this was the SS80. George knew the best way to promote his new motorcycle was to show its capability in racing, so just days after it was unveiled, he showed up at the London to Exeter trial, where in pouring rain, the new motorcycle took gold, proving to George and to the world that he might have something good on his hands. Though far from the greatest machine George would build, the primary features of the Brough Superior were there. It was both powerful, but also really robustly built, made for speed and long-distance touring in a way that few motorcycles at this time were, especially in Great Britain. And the checks started rolling in for his new SS80 model, named for its top speed, and production began. Early road tests found the Brough Superiors to have incredible performance attained somewhat easily. They were effortless performing motorcycles that were quiet but powerful. And they were motorcycles that just felt refined and lightweight, smooth, and in one sense rather futuristic. Testers also noted the unique, stripped back but beautiful design of this motorcycle. George's understanding of what it took to succeed in long-distance trials really did inform his design and the way he approached manufacturing. He knew where to focus his energy, and the motorcycles were quickly gaining a reputation for their reliability and quality as he continued to just make them better. And at a rather heavy discount from, say, Harley's big twin of the day, enthusiasts were starting to be onto this new motorcycle. George was racing his own bikes in both solo and sidecar trials and winning, but whenever it was time to present his bikes to the public, they would be immaculately clean. It was all very professional. 1923 would be a huge year for Brough Superior. Now his models had the very latest side valve JAP engines. Production was good. Successes in racing, specifically at Brooklands, pushed the company into the general public's eye. People were beginning to consider George's motorcycles among the very best in the world. This was also the year George's father made a flat twin Brough that was apparently capable of 90 miles per hour, just to show his son how it was done, but we don't need to focus on that. But more importantly, this would be the year that Brough Superior would first be called the Rolls-Royce of Motorcycles. In the April edition of The Motorcycle, H.D. Teague said this about the average rider looking at the Brough Superior. To own an SS80 is to occupy a very select niche in the world of wheels, for almost all motorcyclists admire the latest Brough Superior. To consider but a minor point, they have a poor eye for beauty of line who do not. Often, however, their attitude is that of the Ford owner regarding a Rolls-Royce before he has driven one. It costs too much, they argue, and the extra cost is not balanced by the better performance, and even if it is, nobody really wants a machine capable of what the Brough Superior will do. In essence, the motorcycle was too good for most people. George was ecstatic at this idea that his motorcycle could be compared to Rolls-Royce, and ever the savvy businessman, he began plastering this abbreviation in his advertising, the Rolls-Royce of Motorcycles. But was it truly the Rolls-Royce of motorcycles? There was an anecdote told by George of one of the management guys from over at Rolls-Royce showing up at the Brough Superior factory. George was keen to his arrival, so they cleaned up the place and he got all of the workers who were building bikes to throw on pairs of white gloves in hopes of impressing the man. And this apparently worked because Rolls-Royce never took action against Brough for using their name in advertising. But being simply called the Rolls-Royce of Motorcycles really wasn't what George had set out to do when he started designing his first motorcycle and building a team around him to make it a reality. George wanted to build the best motorcycle in the world, the perfect motorcycle as he called it. Brough Superior had made a solid chunk of money from the SS80, enough for George and his team to go back to the drawing board to cook up an all-new model, one that really would shake the foundation of motorcycle development forever. Though this new motorcycle would come out in 1925, the foundation was laid the previous year in racing. Famed British racer and JAP engine tuner Bart known as the Wizard of Brooklands, rode Brough Superior solo and sidecar motorcycles at record-breaking speeds in 1924, and that same year, 9 records were broken by Broughs, thanks to Bart's skills, hitting just shy of 120 miles per hour on a tuned race-ready SS80. George knew that the path to making the ultimate sporting and touring motorcycle would be to utilize this racing setup, and so with that 4-cam JAP engine making 45 horsepower, the new SS100 was born, capable of propelling past 100 miles per hour. And this was truly unheard of for a road-going motorcycle at this time, and it wasn't just an advertising gimmick or a claim. Each SS100 came with a written guarantee that this motorcycle could do 100 miles per hour. The reason this engine was so much more powerful, some 50% more than the previous SS80, had to do with the internals of the JAP engine. It used things like roller bearings throughout the engine, lighter materials. It had an 80mm bore and a 99mm stroke versus the SS80's virtually square bore and stroke that was smaller. Capable of revving well beyond 4,000 RPM, this really was a futuristic engine for its time. George knew that this new model had to be able to do more though than just hit top speeds and then kind of fall apart like other British sport bikes at this time at top speed. He wanted it to really be the ultimate grand touring machine, and so for the suspension, he went with Harley's front fork setup from their racing program to get the best stability possible for people who are going to be cruising at high speeds. At the end of 1924, the Motorcycle magazine published their first road test of the new SS100, and this test is in essence a testament to George's ability to just execute on a plan, because the descriptions you see in this article are really that of a perfect motorcycle for its time. Sure, it could scream past 100 miles per hour, but what they noted more was its stability, its comfort, its usability, and its confidence-inspiring nature. At one point, the tester, George Patchett, was willing to take his hands completely off the handlebars at 95 miles per hour. Performance wasn't everything though. This is something George was always keen to. He wanted his motorcycles to give off an air of professionalism and luxury, with the devil really being in the details. And so the SS100 would go down as one of the most beautiful, timeless designs in motorcycle history. The motorcycle was a picture of high-level craftsmanship, from the imposing long-stroke big twin to the finned alloy exhaust manifolds, and the just slim nature of the bike when you look at it head-on. The single exhaust running down the left side of the bike and splitting behind the back cylinder into 2. Great automotive designs have always been exercises in subtlety and simplicity. Though the SS100 was certainly an over-the-top machine in terms of performance, it just kind of had a confident, simple presence. And again, the standout feature was that unique, flat but wide curved tank with the beautiful but very complicated Bonnickson gauge. If you're bored sometime, go try to figure out how to read an isochronometric instrument like this. Like so many other great sport designs in car and motorcycle history, the SS100 gave the impression of speed even when sitting still. Through its life, the SS100 would gain the reputation as the fastest and best production motorcycle in the world, the ultimate sporting machine, and even those who own and ride them today will tell you that these motorcycles really can hold their own even up against modern traffic as proper grand tourers, which is really impressive when you think about these motorcycles being 80, 90 years old. Racing and record attempts really showed the full character of this motorcycle, which is really impressive when you think about these motorcycles being some 90 to 100 years old. Racing and record attempts really showed the full character of this motorcycle, whether it was treacherous long-distance trials or land speed records. The SS100 was just kind of ready for everything. In 1924, rider Noel Pope set a new 1,000-mile record at the Brooklyn Circuit in England aboard an SS-100, averaging 61 miles per hour for the duration of the endurance race. One of the craziest events at this time was the Austrian Alpine Trials. This was a major event where riders would take on 1,700 kilometers of mountain roads in some of the worst conditions imaginable for 8 days. Every Brough rider, including George himself, though crashing often in this competition, took home gold medals, sweeping the entire event. This wasn't just a different breed of motorcycles. These were also different breeds of men entirely, and I do really wish that we would bring back these old school hardcore long distance trials. In celebration of this event, Brough made the SS-100 Alpendine, a replica of the race bike used, featuring many of the amenities of that event's bike and with a guarantee of 110 miles per hour in this tuned form. Maybe the greatest speed record for Brough Superior came about in 1929 when George's son, also named George, rode a highly tuned and specified SS-100 to an incredible 130.6 miles per hour, absolutely shattering the previous record. Though the SS-100 really would go down as kind of the ultimate Brough Superior, and of course the V-twin setup, though thoroughly American, in England it was synonymous with Brough. Many different models were experimented with. In 1927, a one-off race-ready single-cylinder Brough was built in 500cc form. A sort of mini SS-100 was made that same year for production, featuring a scaled-down 680cc JAP twin. And in terms of styling, it was SS-100 completely. But perhaps the most unique model to be developed was the V4 Brough. Prior to its unveil, George had been imagining what his motorcycle could look like in V4 configuration, but JAP didn't make a V4. Obviously, nobody was really making V4s at this time. We don't exactly know how this engine was created, but it's probably through a contract with George's father's business. Regardless, though often criticized for using other companies' parts, this engine was completely built in-house and really, really impressive. As far as we know, only one was made and unveiled at the Olympia show in 1927, and George made a huge spectacle of the whole thing, with the engine displayed in a glass case and guarded by police officers. Though the V4 Brough would never go into production, it really does stand as a testament to George's relentless pursuit and really just his forward-thinking attitude. Brough Superior would even make 6, 8, and even 12-cylinder cars later on in their life, and those vehicles would be known as the Brough Superior of cars. Okay, that wasn't that funny. It started as a desire to make himself a car, but the second it became known that Brough Superior was making cars, requests started pouring in, so they went with it. Very much a team effort and very much made with other companies' parts. The Brough Superior cars were great and some were even rather performance-oriented, but they never quite lived up to the Brough name, and the Depression really didn't help matters. And so Brough Superior cars were pretty short-lived. One of the most fascinating stories surrounding Brough Superior is that of T.E. Lawrence and his obsession with these motorcycles. Of course, he was known primarily through the world as a British war hero and of course, an influential military leader and kind of a romantic figure. But after the war, he was a bit of a wreck, and he really found solace in the ownership and riding of Brough Superior motorcycles, 7 in total through his life, and ridden in all sorts of different parts of the world. He wrote at length about how wonderful it was just to ride, but also specifically to ride fast. And Brough Superiors really did offer a way to experience speed and performance at this time, without the raw riding experience of a typical race bike. And he named his bikes George 1 through George 7. Some of them had sidecars, others were more tuned, solo kind of race bikes, many of which were crashed and damaged through their life. George number 7, though, would be the final motorcycle that T.E. would ride, though he did have another one on order, and boy did he love it. He wrote to George regarding the machine, "Dear Mr. Brough, it is the silkiest thing I have ever ridden, partly because of the perfect tune, partly from the high gear, but mostly because of the spring sprocket, I suppose. I think this is going to be a very excellent bike. The crowds that gape at her just now will stop looking after she gets dirty, and that may be soon if only the RAF give me spare time enough to use the poor thing." By April of 1934, George number 7 had racked up 19,000 miles in just a few years of ownership under T.E. Lawrence. On May 13th, 1935, though little is known specifically about how it happened, T.E. Lawrence would crash George number 7, and ultimately this would be fatal. We do know that shortly after breakfast, T.E. Lawrence began began itching to go for a ride, like we all do, so he got out the Brough and went into the nearby town of Bovington. After leaving the butcher's to head back home to Clouds Hill, that very butcher's helper had already headed out on a bicycle along with his friend, and while coming out of a dip, probably speeding, the cyclists were crossing the road, he hadn't seen them, and in an attempt to avoid the young man, T.E. Lawrence would hit the back of the bicycle and crash his motorcycle. Lawrence was unconscious and badly injured, and would succumb to those injuries on May 19th. He wasn't wearing a helmet, not surprisingly, and this accident would actually push forward the development of motorcycle crash helmets. Also, I didn't know the exact dates of the crash and his death, but oddly enough, my wife was born on May 13th and my son was born on May 19th, so kind of weird. There's all sorts of conspiracy theories surrounding T.E. Lawrence's death, but what we do know is that, like many, he liked to go fast and ultimately he would pay the ultimate price for it. T.E. Lawrence's very public motorcycle accident and death didn't really do wonders for either Brough Superior or the motorcycling world as a whole, but it's certainly not the reason for the demise of Brough Superior. Like so many other great manufacturers who closed their doors, especially at this time, it was a mix of various factors. The economic downturn during the Great Depression of the 1930s affected the motorcycle industry as a whole, leading to reduced consumer spending and declining sales, and in particular, Brough Superior, known for expensive luxury motorcycles, they struggled to maintain profitability in the face of these economic hardships. Also, George Brough's relentless focus on producing handcrafted, bespoke motorcycles really did limit its production capacity. While this approach did ensure high-quality craftsmanship and exclusivity, it also constrained the company's ability to compete with larger manufacturers that could produce motorcycles at lower costs and higher volumes, and over time, other companies just caught up to them. Through this time, the motorcycle market became increasingly competitive, with larger manufacturers introducing more affordable, mass-produced sporting models. Brough Superior faced stiff competition from companies such as Norton, Triumph, and BSA, which offered motorcycles at lower price points and with somewhat comparable performance by the end of their run. And as innovative as these motorcycles were in their early days, Brough Superior's reluctance to embrace newer technologies such as unit construction and overhead valves really limited its ability to innovate and compete effectively in the evolving motorcycle market. While the company maintained a reputation for engineering excellence, its reluctance to adopt modern manufacturing techniques and design innovations may have hindered its competitiveness. And like many small businesses, Brough Superior faced challenges related to management and financial stability. There were multiple ownership changes. And of course, then World War II happened, which just further exacerbated all of Brough Superior's challenges. And they really never recovered in the post-war period amidst shifting consumer preferences and economic uncertainties. The company ceased production in 1940, marking the end of an era for one of the most legendary names in motorcycling history. But how does Brough Superior, and specifically the SS100, stack up against the best and greatest motorcycles of all time in their own respective eras? One thing you can't ignore is the makeup of Brough's motorcycles versus, say, the greatest motorcycles from Honda, the CB750, or even something like the Vincent Black Shadow. Those are motorcycles that were designed and produced in-house, and notably they were composed primarily of in-house parts, besides things like shared carburetors and electrics. But the engine, frame, suspension, something like a Vincent Black Shadow is just much more built and designed in-house, if that makes sense. The CB750 or Triumph Bonneville, they came about from years and decades of in-house research and development, which is not how Brough Superiors exactly were made. Now, on the one hand, I'd say that they have the edge for that reason. Even George's father, his Brough motorcycles were more in-house than Brough Superior. But on the other hand, Brough Superior really was the little guy going up against the big guys. It's kind of an underdog story where the underdog does whatever it can to somehow come out on top, and that's exactly what Brough Superior represents. With a motorcycle that was far ahead of anything available at its time, even if it was kind of a parts bin motorcycle, it was one of those motorcycles that was more than the sum of its parts, and that's what makes it incredible. It's a different kind of great motorcycle, if that makes sense, especially if you compare it to something like, some of Harley's motorcycles or the CB750 or the Hayabusa. In the end, I think the reason Brough Superior stands out in motorcycle history is because of that difference. George Brough's story and what he accomplished, it's just not like what we see with other manufacturers. In a sense, I would liken Brough more to Duesenberg than probably Rolls-Royce, again because of this relentless pursuit of making the ultimate machine. And does it really matter that the motorcycles had Harley forks or JAP engines? I don't think it does. It's not as though Brough couldn't have set out to develop their own engines, and they did at points. It just wasn't the best path forward for them in trying to make the best motorcycle in the world, and why change something that works? They also could have went and made more economical motorcycles to make more money, but that just wasn't their identity. They were a luxury brand, perhaps the greatest motorcycle luxury brand ever, and luxury brands just do things different. In the sense you get, again, from owners of these motorcycles through history, is that they truly are incredible pieces of engineering and craftsmanship, and perhaps more important, man, they're just incredible to ride. And what else do you really need from a motorcycle? Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this bit of motorcycle history. Hope you learned something, and I would love to hear from you in the comments below. I'd love to know what you think the greatest motorcycle of all time is. All right, we'll see you in the next one. Ride safe.